Is that it? All right,
All
we're
right.
started. All right, thanks, Galacia. All right, hello, everyone, and welcome to the fifth installment of what is the Graduate Student Association's Politics Today series. And this series was conceived with the intent of engaging some of our regional community-based organizations in discussions that really explore and dive into some of today's most pressing topics that are impacting graduate student life. For those of you who don't know, I am Nicholas Palaschuk, and I am the GSA Partnerships Coordinator. And so today I'll be leading a discussion with Sarah Wiley, a violence prevention educator with the Sexual Assault Support Center of Waterloo Region. The SASC is a local organization supporting survivors of sexual violence whose work seeks to transform systems promoting gender-based violence using an intersectional feminist-based approach through listening, facilitated healing, and resilience building. Just a brief background on our guest speaker today. So Sarah is an award-winning activist, survivor, speaker, and facilitator of learning. She has a bachelor's degree in psychology with a minor in sexuality, marriage, and family studies from the University of Waterloo, as well as a master's degree in social justice and community engagement from Wilfrid Laurier. In 2017, Sarah received the provincial draw, the Line Post-Secondary Sexual Violence Prevention Award. In 2018, received the University of Waterloo Equity and Inclusivity Award, all for her work to address campus sexual violence. In her work, Sarah uses her education and lived experience to engage communities in conversation about gender-based violence using a feminist and anti-oppressive lens. In her spare time, Sarah enjoys pole dancing, painting, and spending time with her cat. Now, as part of the GSA's Safe Love Week, I believe that this is a particularly timely discussion today, as we'll be exploring the world of sexual violence and assault as it is today, while learning more about the educational, counseling, and support services provided by SASC, and in hopes of providing some clarity into defining sexual violence and how it manifests today in sexual assault. Today's discussion will also explore healing options for survivors, recommendations on how to support others, and be an ally, while also providing an opportunity for graduate student Q&A. So first off, Sarah, on behalf of the GSA, welcome and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So I'm hoping we might be able to begin today's discussion with hearing a bit about on your background and your role with the Sexual Assault Support Center.
Yeah. So you did a wonderful introduction. Thank you so much. Just to add to that, I guess. So I have worked at SASC for almost 3 years now, and was a volunteer for a few years before that as well. I got into doing sexual violence prevention work as a survivor, and kind of really started my journey in this work at the University of Waterloo as a Women's Center coordinator and doing lots of grassroots activism around sexual violence prevention, feminism, anti-racism, social justice, and all of those pieces. And yeah, and now I get paid to talk about this stuff for a living, which is just great. I've also had the pleasure to support many survivors on their journey to healing through our 24-hour support line, as well as through our group counseling program. So I'm stoked to be here to talk a little bit more about the work that we do at SASC.
That's amazing. It's rare to see someone be able to marry sort of passion and purpose so well within the job. So congratulations on that. And
Yeah, thank you.
before we get too deep into your work and some of the services your organization provides, I think it might be helpful for everyone who's taking in this discussion, if you might help sort of distinguish what we mean when we say the term sexual violence, and how does this differentiate from sexual assault, and maybe where is there a sort of the overlap between the two?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so there's lots of different terms, and it can definitely get confusing. Sexual violence is an umbrella term for a variety of sexually motivated crimes. They're often rooted in power and control over another person. And typically they are gendered. So the vast majority of the time, we know the people who experience sexual and gender-based violence are women, girls, and trans people. While we know that people of any gender can experience sexual violence and anybody can perpetrate sexual violence, it tends to be women, girls, and trans people who experience that violence and men who perpetrate it. Men who experience sexual violence in their lifetime typically experienced it as children, and the vast majority were still assaulted by men. So it has this really gendered quality to it. We also know that folks who are Black, Indigenous, who are queer, trans, who are sex workers or newcomers to our community are all at an increased risk for experiencing sexual violence. Now, within this umbrella of sexual violence, there are lots of different things, as I mentioned. So sexual assault is anytime somebody touches you when you don't want to be touched, which includes probably what people first think of, which is rape. And then we have sexual harassment, another really common one that folks may have heard of, which is when somebody makes comments of a sexual or gendered nature and they're unwanted. And then there's a lot of other forms of sexual violence as well that maybe we don't talk about as much. So we think about exploitation and trafficking. So when somebody's being forced to sell sexual services against their will. We think of childhood sex abuse. We think of stalking. There's things like voyeurism, when somebody watches you when you don't want to be watched or maybe don't know that you're being watched. And all of these are forms of sexual violence, and they're a really important piece of the discussion that maybe we talk about less than sexual assault, which is also very important as well.
Well, thank you for providing clarity on that. Certainly, I mean, with the wealth of sort of these terms and, you know, a lot of the different interpretations, the common theme, what I hear is there's an unwanted sort of experience that one encounters with. And I feel like really understanding and having a sort of conceptual definition or a strong conceptual understanding of what these terms mean and what they entail really goes a long way in enabling someone to take action, to be an ally, or to, if you're a victim, to be aware that you are a victim of something that is not warranted.
Yeah, and exactly, you hit the nail on the head. So the real piece there is consent. So when folks are being touched or have comments or gestures that are unwanted, things that they are not consenting to, that's when it becomes sexually violent behavior. And there's lots of ways, unfortunately, folks use the internet to do those things as well. So sending people pictures of your genitals without consent, spreading somebody else's pictures or videos without their consent is also sexually violent behavior.
You know, now as a sort of recipient of the GSA's Philanthropy Fund initiative, the work you and your organization do remains really closely aligned with our stance on ensuring at least graduate student mental wellness. And with that in mind, I'm hoping if you can speak to the sort of the breadth of services and supports that SASC offers and how they might help to positively impact mental wellness.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I should say too, in thinking about all the services I'm going to talk about, it's also important to know that we work really closely with the Sexual Violence Prevention and Response Office at the University of Waterloo. So SV Pro has a lot of services and supports specific to University of Waterloo students, as well as staff, faculty. And our center is here to complement that. So we are a community-based sexual assault support center that serves the entire Waterloo region. And we provide a myriad of services and supports to survivors. So this includes our 24-hour support line, which is a phone number you can call anytime, day or night. And there will be somebody on the other end who is trained in talking to you about whatever you're struggling with. That service is also available to folks who are supporting survivors. So maybe your friend tells you about an experience and you want to debrief that disclosure that you received with somebody, and you can call our line and do that. Also, if you maybe want to call with the person, so maybe you're in a supporter role and you're like, I don't know what to say right now, We have people all the time call with somebody to our 24-hour support line. If you're not a phone person, don't worry. We also have online chat support. So that's a service where you can go on our website and chat live with, again, one of those trained staff or volunteers. And that isn't 24/7 like our phone line is. It's mostly during the week, during the day, just because it's newer and we're still working on developing some training and things around that to get more folks trained on working on that. We also have individual and group counseling. One of the things that's really unique about SASC is there's no limit to the amount of time you can access counseling at SASC. So you can be with us for as long or as short as you need. Our group counseling program is really great. There are a variety of workshops and groups on topics like flashbacks and nightmares, developing boundaries, disordered eating. We have a Friday drop-in just for anybody who's a survivor and wants to connect with folks who are going through similar things. We also have a family court support program for folks who have experienced intimate partner violence and are now going through the family court system. So things like custody, access, peace bonds are all things our family court program can help with. And we also have a legal advocacy program related to criminal court. So if you are pursuing criminal justice related to a case of sexual violence, we have a legal advocate who can support you through that process. And we have an anti-human trafficking program that supports folks who've been forced to sell sex. So this is different than folks who are sex workers who are choosing to sell sex because it's their job. This is folks who are either have in the past or currently or at risk of being forced to sell sex. And they provide really unique wraparound services in that way. And then finally, I know this is a lot,
Yeah.
Last one is public education, which is the area I work in. So our public education team goes out into community and engages folks in conversations about ending sexual and gender-based violence and preventing folks from ever having to reach out to our center. And that includes our Male Allies program. So I work with an awesome team of masculine folks who engage men and boys in conversations about healthy masculinity and addressing the fact that men are perpetrating the vast majority of this violence.
Well, thank you for touching on all of those. There's such a wealth and breadth of services, and I think it really highlights the importance of accessibility to this, knowing that trauma takes on many different forms, and sexual violence is perpetrated in many different forms as well. And it's so contextual in nature, and who and what, who feels comfortable with it, with what. And I think you're doing great work there. One of the key things, this overarching theme within the diversity of services is this idea of awareness, both as it impacts your ability to be an ally, but also awareness of victimship as well. And so with working in specifically the public education sphere, I'm wondering if you might be able to give some examples of some of the events and past engagement opportunities you and SASC have been holding as part of the public education program.
Yeah, we actually do a lot of stuff on all the post-secondary campuses, including UW. So workshops on consent, healthy relationships, on responding to disclosures, how to support somebody who has experienced sexual violence, how to be an active bystander and prevent sexual violence from happening and make our communities safer. We work with folks of all ages, of all backgrounds. So I work a lot with younger youth. So I go into elementary schools and high schools a lot, talking to folks about all those topics that I mentioned. We even have a program called Taylor the Turtle that's for preschool aged kids about preventing sexual violence and their right to a safe body and what to do when they feel unsafe. All of our programming is age appropriate and in line with the Ontario physical health curriculum. And then we do lots of corporate and workplace education as well. So both social services in our community and in the broader province will reach out to us for training on things like neurobiology of trauma, how to make their services trauma informed. But we also have a program called Raise the Bar that does corporate training on sexual harassment prevention. So Raise the Bar goes in and provides workshops and education that are tailored to that workplace and the needs of that workplace to foster gender equity, social justice, and sexual violence prevention.
Amazing. You mentioned this term active bystander. And I'm wondering if we might be able to dive into that a bit, particularly as it pertains to sort of sexual violence on university campuses. So as a graduate student at the University of Waterloo or Wilfrid Laurier, what does an active bystander look like? What are some of the trends in terms of sexual violence on university campuses? What are maybe some tips to be a more active bystander and help prevent sexual violence before it occurs?
Absolutely. Yeah. And if folks are interested in this, we provide full training. So this is going to be the super quick version. But I would be happy to, if you want to send me an email or whatever, to connect you with the full training. So an active bystander is somebody who sees something bad happening, and rather than just ignoring it, deciding it's not their problem, not their business, they do something about it. And we know that sexual violence is incredibly common in post-secondary spaces. And it means that there's an extra importance for leaders in post-secondary spaces like yourselves at the GSA in addressing things like rape culture when they come up. And what I mean by that is rape culture is the way in which we as a society normalize sexual violence and blame victims rather than perpetrators for the crime. Sexual violence doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of a system and a structure that allows it to happen. It comes out of the sexist attitudes, the locker room talk, the victim blaming, the colonial racist attitudes about Indigenous women and Black women. And all of this normalizes ignoring consent, ignoring boundaries, and makes us more comfortable with sexual violence in our communities. One way we can think about this is having your butt grabbed at a club. Incredibly, incredibly normalized. However, it's unwanted touch, unless you want your butt grabbed, which, like, all power to you. You haven't asked for consent. And it probably made that person feel uncomfortable or unsafe. Yet, it's something that, especially for women who are university age and going to places like Phil's, is incredibly, incredibly normalized. So what we have to do is when we see things happening that perpetuate that rape culture and allow that sexual violence to continue, we have to interrupt them. And there are a variety of ways we can do this. Hollaback, which is a great sexual violence prevention organization, has something called the 5 Ds of bystander intervention. So document, direct, delay, distract, and delegate. So document, take notes on what you're seeing, take pictures, videos. Oftentimes survivors have their memory impacted. And if they choose to pursue criminal justice, having evidence can be really helpful. Now, we're not going to share those videos or pictures or information with other people other than the person who is impacted. So we're not going to post it on World Star Hip Hop. We are providing it to the person, to the survivor, if they want to use that for evidence. A direct approach would be approaching the people and saying, hey, I see what's happening. It's not okay. That joke you made, what you're doing right now, whatever it is, it's not cool and you need to cut it out. It can also be directing what you're saying to the person who's being impacted and saying, are you okay? I'm seeing something happening right now that's not all right. And let me know if I can help. So it's in front of whoever's around, it's really direct. You can think of it like calling out. A delayed approach would be going up to the person after the fact and saying, hey, I saw what happened. Are you okay? Do you want to talk about it? Is there anything I can do? This is a moment if you had collected some information and the document, you could provide them with that. You could also use the delayed approach and go up to the person who caused that harm and call them in a little bit and provide some education. Like, hey, that joke that you made earlier, it wasn't really funny and it was actually kind of hurtful. Can we talk about that a little bit? Distract approach looks like doing anything to interrupt the harm without addressing it directly. So there's times where it's unsafe or uncomfortable, or maybe it's just not a good time for us to use a more direct approach, but we need to stop what's happening right now. So this could look like changing the subject. It could look like pretending to be confused. So there's lots of, you'll see YouTube videos of people going up to women who are being harassed and being like, hey, how are you? Even though they don't know them, but they're giving that person an out from the situation. And then finally, a delayed approach, or a delegate approach just means getting help from others around you. So identifying who your allies and accomplices are in that space, who are the people maybe who have more privilege. So I, as a small woman, maybe wouldn't always be safe putting my body between somebody who is perpetrating sexual violence. But maybe some of my colleagues and male allies who are bigger and male, they might have more privilege in the space, and often, unfortunately, men only listen to men, so can be helpful in that way. You can also, this might be a time to call our 24-hour support line, emergency services if needed, but of course being mindful of the fact that police, for many situations, make the situation worse and more dangerous. But recognizing that sometimes we need help to get help from others, and that's where that delegate comes in.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And as a past consultant, the sort of 5D approach certainly resonates with some of the management consulting work I've done in the past. But you also really touched on a really interesting note there, particularly with the document-based approach and the sensitivity of how in which you share that information and going directly to the victim rather than going out of your way, posting it online, because it really sort of parallels contemporary discussions of cancel culture, but also the potential to perpetuate indirect violence to the perpetrator. So I think that's a really important note to highlight there.
Yeah, we want to keep it centered on the survivor. So as I mentioned earlier, sexual violence is a crime of power and control. So any opportunity we have, we want to give survivors choice and power about what happens next. So giving them power over what happens to those videos or pictures is a great way to do that.
Amazing. Now, earlier on, and certainly in a lot of the sort of website and informative pieces on your organization, there's this sort of consistent messaging about an intersectional feminist approach. And for, I'm sure for a lot of people, they might not be directly familiar with what that exactly entails. And so as sort of a specific analytic framework that sort of, I think, shapes our understanding of how women experience sexual violence, this seems incredibly central to the work of your organization, how you sort of frame and really design the services and support. So, and I'm hoping you might be able to sort of explore, what does this approach exactly entail, and how does it maybe differentiate from other approaches to sexual violence work?
Yeah, so feminism is the working towards equality for people of all genders. And then the intersectionality piece kind of adds to that. So intersectionality was a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who's an incredible Black feminist writer, thinker, scholar, who in the 80s noticed that Black women were experiencing both sexism and racism, and that those experiences couldn't be separated. So she looked for a way to understand them together. The sexism that a Black woman experiences is often racialized, thinking about words that like ghetto, calling women angry Black women, assumptions that Black women are hypersexual. all of those pieces that are heavily racist and also sexist and different from the experiences of white women or Black men. And since then, folks in the social services, social justice fields have taken the theory of intersectionality to understand the ways in which privileges and oppressions in general overlap and intersect. So for instance, I am a woman, which means that I experience oppression, but I'm also white. I'm also very educated. I'm also queer. So I experience both privilege and oppression in a variety of ways. And you can't just look at one aspect of who I am to understand my experience. When we think about sexual violence, as I mentioned earlier, we know that particular folks, particularly those who are more marginalized, are more likely to experience sexual violence. And when folks access services, we need to understand who they are as a whole person to be able to provide the care that they need in the most effective way. For instance, we know that people who are housing insecure or homeless are more likely to be trafficked. We also know that trans youth are both more likely to be homeless and more likely to be trafficked. So that means that when we're supporting people who maybe are trans, homeless, and being trafficked, we have to look at how has transphobia impacted your experiences of trauma? How has being houseless meant that you have difficulties accessing services? How has that impacted the ways that you experience that violence? And how those things cannot be separated from one another. Most sexual assault centers use this kind of framework now. Historically, there was unfortunately spaces, including ours, that, for instance, weren't inclusive of trans women coming into spaces. Now, folks of all gender are welcome to come to our center and most centers in Ontario, if not all. But we still have a lot of work to do to make our services more inclusive and more welcoming and responsive to the community and the issues that they're experiencing. SASC is doing a lot of work right now on anti-racism. So our staff are going through anti-racism training, where we have a committee that's looking at evaluating our policies and practices to make them more anti-racist. Because it's an ongoing process. We're always learning and finding new ways that we can better serve survivors in our community.
Well, it's amazing the sort of paradoxical tensions that sort of permeate the work that you and your organization do, because the way one experiences sexual violence isn't just personal, it isn't just cultural, it isn't just according to sociodemographics. It's all of those in which in different ways create synergistic and antagonistic effects that all shape the outcome and the way someone experiences sexual violence. Absolutely. Which shows the complexity and the incredible nuance of sexual support work. Yeah. You touched on this idea of anti-racism, and I'm wondering, and again, for me, it sort of reminds me of recent discussions, particularly coming out of the Black Lives Movement, where the advocacy now is focused on not just being not racist, you have to be vocally against racism. And I'm wondering if this similar sort of push towards sort of sexual violence and sexual assault is either being sort of supported by SASC, or is this sort of something we're seeing in sort of contemporary society as well?
Yeah, and what I think what you're hitting on there is around like allyship, right? And what does it mean to be somebody who actively wants to end sexual and gender-based violence and support survivors in their lives? And the ways that we do that is through that bystander intervention piece that I mentioned, and interrupting that rape culture. and also by being trauma informed. And there's a big push right now in social service circles for the last few years to become trauma informed, to make services more trauma informed. And that it sounds like kind of a vague thing. And what it essentially means is recognizing the ways that trauma impact clients who, for instance, might be accessing services at the GSA, and ways that we can make those spaces more accessible for them and safer. And by safer, I'm not talking about things like, you know, having to tiptoe around everybody and feel like you're going to get canceled or called out. What I'm talking about is giving people signals of safety that let them know that we're going to avoid triggering them again in the future. And triggered, again, is one of those words, and all the things I'm talking about right now, people associate with being offended, right? And I'm not talking about being offended. Being triggered is actually a physiological response to a memory of trauma coming up. Neurobiology of trauma is fascinating. And our bodies don't stop that fight or flight or freeze or fawn response once the danger is over. Instead, what happens is when a memory is triggered of that trauma, maybe by a smell, an emotion, a texture, sound, sometimes what happens is brains decide, oh, we're back in trauma territory. Something bad's going to happen. We have to do what we have to do to stay alive. And that means it has nothing to do with being offended. So by being trauma informed, we create spaces and relationships with people in which I say, how can I prevent triggering you in the future? Maybe it means having scent-free spaces or spaces that are free of loud noises as much as possible, or asking folks what their pronouns are, addressing power differences in the room, and making space for times when we make mistakes, and asking how we can be better and supporting each other.
You know, this idea of sensitivity, you know, again, you know, similarly, a lot of discussions towards cross-cultural sensitivity, but also now building on this idea of trauma sensitivity, and being extremely conscious of it as well as an ally, as an active bystander. You know, are there signs or behaviors as an ally or an active bystander of someone who is experiencing that physiological response? Are there typical signs to look out for? And then, you know, what might I do to help support that person in that exact moment?
Yeah, so again, do whole workshops on this stuff, and would love to have anybody who's watching come to any of those. This is the quick version. But essentially, those 4 responses to trauma I mentioned: fight or flight, you've probably heard of, fighting, getting angry, punching, kicking, trying to be loud, overpower the situation; flight, running away, avoiding, procrastinating even. Freeze is when somebody is like deer in the headlights. Maybe they go numb, they dissociate, so like checking out from reality, disconnecting from reality. And fawn, which is actually when folks are extra nice and passive and go along with what other people want to try to reduce the threat of violence. So if, and you won't know, like most of the time you won't know when somebody's having a trauma trigger come up. But what we can do is, when we act in a trauma-informed way, we treat everybody with the compassion and care, understanding that trauma might be impacting some of the ways that they interact with us or some of the choices they make. Or so, for instance, if somebody is late to a meeting, or if they need to leave suddenly, or if they're really quiet one day, not assuming that that means that that person is better or worse or wrong or bad or stupid or crazy, but maybe something's coming up for them right now. We all have trauma. COVID is trauma, right? Some of our traumas are bigger and more impactful for some people than others. But if we treat each other with compassion and understanding and assuming that we're all doing the best that we can, we're just more likely to be kinder and better to each other in general, but we're also going to be more supportive to survivors of trauma.
I think you hit the nail right on the head there, and it very much mirrors some of the work I hear that's going on at the University of Waterloo, and this idea of building a culture of caring.
Yes.
And the power of listening and the power of empathy. And so, moving forward here, we've discussed a lot of, the breadth of the services that your organization offers. And I want to dive deeper into the area that I think it's important, I think it's important for survivors to really understand the supports that are available to them, but also how to go about engaging with an organization like SASC. If it's your first sort of time experiencing sexual violence or sexual assault at a personal level. So maybe more specifically, how might a survivor of sexual violence begin to engage in their healing journey? What's the best place to start? What are some of the key elements of the healing journey or the healing process?
Yeah. First of all, if there's survivors watching, I see you, I'm with you, I believe you. Please know you're not alone. And there are folks who are here and ready to listen whenever you need us. Our center, all of our services are entirely free. There's no cost to access any of our services. So the easiest way to probably get connected with us is to just Google SASC, S-A-S-C, and go to our website. And on there, you will find an intake form. It just asks some questions about what kind of services you're looking for, and then we'll get you connected with our intake worker, who will then, depending on the services you're looking for, either get you connected right away, or for individual counseling programs. So if you're looking to talk to a counselor one-on-one, unfortunately, there's a wait list, which sucks, and I hate it. Sexual violence prevention and response work is incredibly underfunded. Mental health work in general is incredibly underfunded, which means that despite a lot of awesome folks in our community who've donated and supported our work, we have a wait list where folks are waiting to be able to see a counselor. There are lots of supports you can access in the meantime. So please do not let the waitlist deter you from reaching out. Our group counseling, there's no waitlist. And all of our other programs, the court support program, legal advocacy, anti-human trafficking, no waitlist for any of those. And then knowing that healing is a long process, and it's not linear. No two journeys look the same. Every survivor is entirely different, and there's no right or wrong way to experience survivorhood. It's very common for folks to take months, weeks, years, decades to name their experience as sexual violence, and just as long, if not longer, to heal from that. You might have days that feel good and you don't think about your trauma for weeks or months at a time, and then you have periods where it's not so good. And our team is here to support you through all of that. Like I said, there's no limits to the amount that you can access our services. We have clients who come and see us for 20 years at a time. That's totally fine. We're here for you. And yeah, just reach out, call our 24-hour support line if you're not sure if you want to access our services, if you want to fill out an intake form, maybe you just want to test the waters a little bit. We're here for you.
I appreciate those words, and I think they're going to carry incredible power with the graduate student community taking this in. You sort of mentioned the group counseling, and particularly the accessibility. It not having that initial wait list. You know, what might you say, or if you can offer some words of advice in terms of the power potentially that lies within the group counseling experience
Mhm.
versus individual, some of the amazing things that come out of group conversations and how they impact the healing process, but also someone who might be intimidated to go into the group versus individual counseling as well.
Yeah, I would say with folks that I've talked to, it's super common to folks be like, no, I don't want to do groups. I just want to talk one-on-one with a counselor. And that's fair. That's super valid. You do you and do what works for you. I think a lot of folks who haven't done group counseling, that comes from a place of, as you say, being nervous or a little worried about trying out that group environment. Folks are worried that they're going to be put on the spot and forced to share things. We don't do that. You're never required to share anything. And they also get worried about hearing about other people's experiences. There are very clear group guidelines and things that, as we just talked about trauma-informed care, that we try to reduce the risk of triggers. And there's lots of things. Our groups program also has workshops where you don't even have to really engage with the other people in the space. So you could go to a 1-hour workshop presented by our team on boundaries for survivors, or on coping with nightmares. And you don't even have to talk to anybody. But I would encourage folks to consider the group environment, because folks who do kind of get over that initial fear and decide to go for a group often have really, really incredibly positive feedback. The folks who run our groups program are incredible, and are very skilled facilitators and create really beautiful spaces where folks who are going through similar things can connect with one another, share their experiences, learn that they're not alone, and learn from each other. So often, I've had the privilege of facilitating a few of the group counseling spaces, and so often the folks learn from each other, the participants learn from each other more than they learned from me. And that's beautiful and it's great. And that's the whole point of groups. So if you're thinking about groups, consider it. We have a really great Friday drop-in group. There's not like a specific topic or anything for that one. It's just every Friday. It's called Alone Together. Hence, pandemic, folks can drop in virtually and connect with other survivors and just talk about what you're going through. Or you can kind of sit back quietly and just listen for the first couple of meetings, and that's totally fine. So yeah, try it out if you're thinking about it.
Amazing. Building off the sort of focus on victims and moving now towards this idea of ally, which I think in today's climate is something we hear a lot about, and we've touched a bit throughout the interview, and whether it be definitely in discussions surrounding BIPOC students, LGBTQ plus communities, I imagine it certainly applies to the world of sexual violence. Now more than ever, society certainly tasks us with supporting and empowering others in our community, and asking, what can I do to help everyone else or others around me? And so building off this idea, I'm hoping you might be able to help clarify, what being an ally of sexual violence entails. Are there specific recommendations you have on how to go about being a better ally, on how to improving allyship? But also, are there specific questions that I might ask if I, to a community member, to a friend, to a family member, who, to engage them in these types of conversations in a sensitive manner?
Yeah, absolutely. So allyship to survivors of sexual violence definitely includes some of that bystander intervention pieces that I mentioned earlier. But as you're pointing to, it also means being supportive to individuals in our lives who've experienced sexual violence. Whether or not you know it or not, survivors. 1 in 3 women, 1 in 6 men, half of all trans people will experience sexual violence in their lifetime. So that means that if people in your lives aren't talking to you about their experiences of sexual violence, it means that you've probably done something to signal to them that you're not a safe person to talk to it about. And I would really reflect on what that is. You know, when we see celebrities in the news who have come out about intimate partner violence, do you victim blame that person or assume that they're lying? When we see people making rape jokes or even just laughing along at rape jokes, that tells us that they don't take sexual violence seriously. If you are having a conversation where somebody has told you that they've experienced sexual violence, believe that person. It is not your job to be a detective to investigate that crime. It's your job to be a supporter. There's a myth out there that people lie about sexual violence to get fame or money or attention, when in fact we know that that's really just not true. People lie about sexual violence about 2% of the time, which is the same as any other crime. People are just as likely to lie about having their car stolen as they are to lie about sexual assault. So believe that person, tell them you believe them, and let them know that it's not their fault. We want to validate their experience and their choices and recognize that they didn't do anything to cause what happened to them. The only thing that causes rape is rapists. We also want to listen, give them space to talk about their experience in their own time, in their own way. Don't judge them or minimize their experience or push for more details that they might not be ready for. Practice that empathy. Try to imagine what it feels like to be in their shoes. You don't have to be a survivor of sexual violence to be able to empathize with one. We all know what it feels like to be scared, to be overwhelmed, to struggle. And we can connect with those hard feelings in ourselves and sit with them, with that person. Finally, we want to just keep all of this information to ourselves as much as possible. So not sharing it with other people, not breaking that confidentiality by going to tell our friends or screenshotting the conversation and sending it to somebody else. Unless we're worried about that person's safety. So if we're worried that they might be thinking about suicide, if we're worried that they might be thinking about hurting others, or if there is unreported child abuse, those are times when we got to get other people involved and get that person some extra help to deal with the situation. Otherwise, you don't need to tell anybody.
I think, I think you touched on that, a really important note there that really emphasizes the power of listening through in being an ally. You also highlighted some statistics that really emphasize the severity of the problem as it exists today. Also circling back to that, the delegate approach, when there are those specific circumstances, being okay to get other people involved, experts involved. And I think that's really important to note for people who are trying to be allies and listeners. To end off sort of today's sort of conversation, I feel like we can't have a true conversation without bringing COVID up to some degree. And I want to explore sort of the intersection between COVID and the impacts we're sort of seeing on sexual violence trends. It seems difficult today, again, to not bring up COVID, but given its sort of profound impacts on how we socialize and interact, our ability to communicate with one another, as well as sort of the immense impacts that lockdowns continue to have on the health and well-being, our ability to physically distance. You touched on the idea of interrelationship violence, and particularly our capacity to distance ourselves from potentially harmful situations. So sort of building on this, are we seeing COVID impact sexual violence? What are some of these trends and impacts that we're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. Short answer, yes, very, very big impacts. As you kind of hinted to, a lot of folks are stuck at home and have been stuck at home for the last 2 years, and home is not safe for everybody. A lot of folks are stuck at home with abusers. A lot of folks are cut off from their support systems and services. So for instance, people who used to come in for appointments or used to take the bus to get to services, not able to do that all of the time right now. All of our services are being offered online, and we were actually very lucky and nimble in that we didn't miss a day. All our services immediately switched to online, and we started offering even group virtual counseling in the first week of lockdowns in 2020, and we have not stopped. I pulled some statistics to highlight the massive increase in need for our services over the pandemic. Before the pandemic, there was things like the Me Too era, Time's Up, Bill Cosby, all of these cases that brought sexual violence to the forefront and had people reaching out for services more than ever. And we were already having problems with our wait list and excessive needs for services before COVID-19. And then when COVID hit, things got a little out of control. So these statistics are comparing December 2019, 2020 to the same time in December 2021 going into 2022. So we saw a 62% increase in requests for individual counseling. We saw a 30% increase in our wait lists for that one-on-one counseling, 148% increase in participants in our closed group programs, a 362% increase in participants in open support groups. So that's like that drop-in that I mentioned before. We saw a 64% increase in folks accessing our family court support program, a 30% increase in folks accessing our anti-human trafficking program, and a 90% increase in participants in our public education workshops. So the demand is very high, and we are very much in need of community partners and folks like the GSA who support us in the work that we do to be able to try to meet the need of survivors in our community.
I mean, if those numbers don't demonstrate an increased need for funding, I don't know what will.
Yeah.
And while I'm seeing these stark increases in people in sort of the accessibility of these services, I think it might also point to the fact that we're entering a world or a culture where it's okay, it's normal to seek out trauma-based therapy and counseling. Yes. It's not a social faux pas anymore, which is so refreshing in an era of of enhanced sort of consciousness of the importance of mental wellness and mental health. So to end off the conversation, reflecting on your past 3 years, for someone on the opposite end who's taking in our discussion today and has always had a passion but never knew how to sort of get involved in the space, what are some tips to do the work that you do to start making a difference in your community?
Volunteer. That's how I got into this work, is by volunteering, going to protests, I did a lot of stuff on campus. So connecting with the Women's Center, connecting with the Sexual Violence Prevention and Response Office, RAISE, other folks on campus who are doing equity seeking work, and then engaging in your own learning. So continuing to watch videos like this, attend workshops, read books, learn from folks who are doing the work, particularly Black, Indigenous, trans women, Two-Spirit folks who have been leading the forefront of this work since long before I was born. And then, yeah, like I said, volunteering at our center or other centers. So if you're interested in volunteering, we take new volunteers all the time. And then you would receive extensive training to be able to be a volunteer at SASC. So folks attend bi-weekly training over, I believe it's 6 weeks. And then, so twice a week for 6 weeks to become a volunteer. And there's a training session happening right now, so I don't think there will be another one until later in the spring, maybe summer. I can't remember when that one starts. But if you're interested, you can go on our website and click the volunteer tab, and it has all the information about how to get connected. Most of our volunteers work on our 24-hour support line. That's how we're able to have it 24/7 for the last 31 years now. And yeah, so those volunteers are vital. You also get really good experience. So if like you're interested in doing this work as a career, interested in mental health supports, social services supports, maybe that's what your degree's in, come on over, get the experience, put it on your resume. We'd love to have you.
Absolutely. And you know what, I'll even follow, I think we can follow up with you and get some of the content or some of the links and contact information. We could put them in the description of the video when it's up on YouTube to give that information to everyone.
Yeah.
You know, I want to thank you immensely for being here and participating in this amazing discussion with the GSA. It's been incredibly illuminating and extremely timely, particularly as we're entering, or we're in mid Safe Love Week now. So I think the conversation is going to be extremely well received. And if nothing else, you know, we're bringing awareness to a topic that desperately needs it. And I hope everyone who's taking this in, you know, has some action items that they can consciously integrate into their own lives and really start to be, you know, stronger allies, more active bystanders. So thank you, Sarah. And with that being said, we'll end the recording.
Thank you.